They said it wasn't punishment, just family peace. But tell me, how would you feel if your own parents texted you? Don't come to Christmas. Your sister feels uncomfortable around you. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just called the restaurant and said, cancel everything. The one paying just got removed. 2 weeks later, while they smiled for photos in their red dresses, the bank called, and their secret collapsed faster than their Christmas tree. I'm Claire Whitmore, and this is how being excluded became my freedom. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. It was almost midnight in Denver when my phone lit up on the nightstand, slicing through the quiet glow of my apartment. I was brushing my hair in the bathroom mirror, the sound of the city muffled behind the double-pane windows. The heat hummed softly, the only sound besides the faint clink of the brush against the counter. When I glanced over and saw my mother's name on the screen, I felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe habit, but it didn't last long. The message was short. 3 lines. Claire, don't come home for Christmas this year. Lydia feels uncomfortable around you. It's better for everyone if you sit this one out. I read it once, then, again and again, as if the words might shift into something kinder on the third read. They didn't. The white light from the screen reflected off the bathroom mirror, cutting across my face. My expression barely moved. Not anger, not sadness. Just the kind of stillness that comes when you realize something has quietly ended without anyone saying goodbye. I stood there for a while, letting the silence settle. Then I turned off the bathroom light, walked barefoot into the living room, and poured myself a glass of wine. The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and detergent, leftovers from the candle I'd burned earlier trying to make the place feel warmer. The twinkle lights I'd strung up years ago still framed the window. I hadn't taken them down because I liked their soft glow. Tonight they looked cruel. I sat at the small kitchen table, the one I'd bought secondhand after my last promotion at the bank. There were Christmas cards still taped to the wall, cards from coworkers, clients, people who didn't know much about me but liked the idea of me. Merry Christmas. Claire, they read in cheerful cursive, you deserve a wonderful year ahead. Apparently not. I thought. I unlocked my phone again, scrolling up through old messages from my mother. Thank you for the transfer, sweetheart. You're always so responsible. We couldn't have done it without you. You've always been the strong one. I used to feel proud when she said that. Now the words made my chest tighten. Strong in my family had always meant silent. It meant fixing things without complaint, paying without question, smiling without expecting thanks. The screen dimmed. I let the phone drop face down on the table and stared at my reflection in the window. Outside, the city was quiet streets, dusted white with snow. Inside, the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. I took a slow sip of wine, the taste sharp, almost bitter. 13 years, I thought. 13 years of wiring money, booking flights, sending gifts, organizing dinners. I barely got to enjoy because Lydia wasn't in the mood or needed space. 13 years of doing everything right, only to be told without a shred of hesitation that I made someone uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. The word rolled around in my head until it almost sounded funny. Lydia had always been fragile. That was the word Mom liked to use. Sensitive, artistic, emotional. I was the opposite. Steady, practical, the problem solver. It was easier for everyone if I was dependable. Dependable became predictable. Predictable became invisible. And now, invisible had become expendable. I picked up my phone again. The message sat there like a final verdict. I didn't text back. I didn't ask why. There was nothing left to ask. Instead, I opened my email, scrolled through my saved messages, until I found the one from the restaurant in St. Louis, the one I'd booked 6 weeks ago. Mom had asked for something classy but intimate. I'd put the deposit down myself, picked the wine, arranged the menu. Even ordered the gold and white centerpiece she said she wanted. I tapped the number at the bottom of the email. The phone rang twice before a cheerful voice answered. Good evening, Brookhaven Bistro. This is Daniel speaking. Hi, I said, my voice steady. This is Claire Whitmore. I reserved the private dining room for the Whitmore Christmas party on the 24th. Oh yes, Ms. Whitmore, he said, polite and warm. We're looking forward to... Cancel it, I interrupted. Cancel everything. There was a pause. I'm sorry, did you? The person paying for the party, I said slowly, was just removed from the guest list. Another pause. Longer this time. Then quietly, "Understood. I'll process that right now. Thank you." I hung up before he could say anything else. The sound of the call ending echoed louder than I expected. I set the phone down on the counter, leaned against it, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Outside, snowflakes drifted down like static against the glass. My reflection looked strange in the window, half real, half ghost. I thought about all the times I'd driven 12 hours through storms just to make it home for the holidays. All the times I'd stayed calm while Lydia threw her tantrums while Mom soothed her like a child. "Don't upset her, Claire. You know how she gets." I thought about the year I paid for the entire dinner when Dad's credit card bounced and how Mom had smiled and said, "You always save the day." Maybe that was the problem. I'd made it too easy for them to forget I was human. I walked to the bookshelf, pulled down the framed family photo that had sat there for years, the four of us smiling under the maple tree in the old backyard. I stared at it for a long time, then set it face down on the shelf. The glass made a soft thud against the wood. In the kitchen, I rinsed my empty glass, set it upside down on the drying rack, and stood there, hands pressed to the counter. The apartment felt heavier than usual, like the air itself was thick with something I couldn't name. I looked around. The neat stacks of bills on the table, the framed diplomas on the wall, the faint trail of snow melting on the windowsill. Everything I'd built had been designed to make life easier for everyone else. And now, when I'd finally run out of things to give, they'd found a way to tell me I wasn't wanted. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I just felt awake. I walked to the window again, watching the snow gather on the railing outside. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. The city lights blurred into gold and white streaks through the falling snow. In that moment, the stillness didn't feel empty. It felt honest. For the first time in years, I wasn't responsible for saving anyone's Christmas. I wasn't the glue holding everything together. I was just a woman standing in her own apartment in the middle of the night, realizing that maybe being left out wasn't a punishment. It was freedom. I whispered to the empty room. "They didn't leave me. They just showed me the door." Then I turned off the lights, left the phone face down on the counter, and watched the snow fall until the city disappeared into quiet. I still remember the sound of the dishwasher that night, the soft hum it made in my first apartment after college back in 2010. I'd just moved to Kansas City for my first real job at a regional bank. My hair was still damp from the shower when the phone rang. It was my mother, her voice tight and shaking. "Your father's doctor says he has to stop working," she said. "They found an arrhythmia. He needs surgery." I heard her trying to hold it together, and then, like always, the apology. "I hate to ask, honey, but things are going to be tight for a while." That was the first time I transferred money home. $500 from my first paycheck. It wasn't much, but I remember how proud I felt, like I'd done something grown up, something good. Dad was a construction foreman his whole life, steady, quiet, the kind of man who fixed everything with his hands. I thought I was just doing the same, fixing what was broken. Over the next few years, that phone call became a pattern. Every time I thought they were standing on their own again, another call came. Another emergency. Another reason to help. When Dad's pacemaker failed in 2014, Mom called crying in the kitchen. I could hear the muffled hum of their refrigerator behind her. "The new one is $7,200, she said softly. "We can't ask the insurance to cover it all." I was 26 working overtime at my firm trying to prove myself to a boss who didn't believe women could handle high-value clients. I'd been saving for grad school. Instead, I sent the money that night. At work the next morning, I sat in the glass conference room while the senior advisor walked through a presentation for a potential investor. My phone buzzed with a message from Mom. "It went well. He's resting now. Thank you, sweetheart. You're a blessing." I slid the phone face down on the table and smiled when the advisor looked at me. I'd become good at that, smiling through the sting. When the meeting ended, one of my coworkers, Mark, stopped me by the door. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied. "Just family stuff." He nodded, the kind of nod that said he didn't want to know. The years blurred together after that. Lydia dropped out of her design program after 2 semesters, said she was reassessing her direction. 6 months later, she enrolled again. Different city, different tuition bill. I covered part of it because Mom said, "You know how hard this has been on her since Dad's heart problems." That became their refrain. "You know how she is." Lydia was the delicate one, the emotional one, the one who felt too much, And I was the stable one, the one who never broke, the one who always came through. There was one winter when she crashed her car. Mom called at midnight, panicked. She's fine, thank God, but the insurance won't cover the repairs. How much, I asked. She hesitated. 3,000, maybe a little more. I sent it before dawn. Lydia texted the next morning. You're the best. I'll pay you back when I can. She never did. Sometimes I told myself I didn't mind. I was building a career. My salary grew each year. I could handle it. What I didn't realize was how quietly resentment grows when you keep telling yourself it's not there. A few years later, I was 31, sitting in my corner cubicle overlooking the city. I had a new client from Chicago on a video call, spreadsheets open across 2 monitors. My inbox pinged. A message from Mom again. Dad needs his meds refilled. Insurance is being a nightmare. It's only $240. But they need it today. Underneath it, another message from Lydia sent 2 minutes later. Hey sis, I'm a little short on rent. Could you spot me $600? Promise I'll Venmo you back next week. 2 messages, same day, same rhythm. I stared at them until they blurred together. Then, without thinking, I opened my banking app and started transferring the money. Every time I clicked send, it felt less like generosity and more like muscle memory. That night, I got home late, dropped my purse on the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. The glow from the screen painted the room in cold light. I clicked open the file I'd been keeping for years. Household ledger, XLSX. I started it the first year I began sending money home just to keep track. Rows and rows of numbers filled the screen. Mortgage payments, medical bills, tuition, credit card balances, groceries, utility bills. The total sat at the bottom like a quiet accusation. $182, $340. 13 years. I scrolled back to the beginning. The first entry, Dad's heart monitor, $500. The last, Lydia, tuition refund, $3,000 not returned. I leaned back, staring at the spreadsheet. My reflection stared back at me in the black strip of the screen, faint but clear. I thought about all the times Mom had said, "You're our rock," and how those words used to fill me with warmth. Now they just felt heavy. Money didn't make me poor. Trust did. I closed the laptop slowly and sat in the dark, listening to the wind against the windows. There was a time when I believed love was measured by sacrifice, that the more you gave, the more you proved your place in the family. But that night, for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped. I looked around the apartment, everything neat, organized, paid for. My life was a fortress built on responsibility. And yet it felt hollow, like I was maintaining a home that didn't belong to me. The heater clicked on again, filling the silence with its soft hum. I exhaled long and slow. I wasn't angry at them. Not yet. But something inside me had shifted the way snow starts to slide just before an avalanche. I turned off the laptop, stood up, and stared out at the Denver skyline. Lights glittered against the dark sky, and for a fleeting moment, I imagined what it would feel like to live a life where I didn't have to save anyone. A life where I could just exist without being the solution. And then, almost without realizing it, I whispered to myself, maybe that's what freedom really costs. The next morning, my alarm went off at 6:30. The Denver sky outside was still gray-blue, thin streaks of light cutting through the blinds. I was halfway through buttoning my blouse when my phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something. Habit curiosity, the same instinct that made me check every detail twice, made me answer. Good morning, this is Claire Whitmore. Hi, Ms. Whitmore, a polite male voice said. This is Michael Torres calling from First Capital Credit Union. I just need to confirm some information regarding a personal line of credit application submitted last week. I frowned. I think you have the wrong person. He hesitated. Is this the same Claire Whitmore whose name appears as co-signer for a loan under a Lydia Whitmore? The room seemed to go still. I could hear the coffee maker hissing behind me. I'm sorry, I said slowly. But I didn't co-sign anything. I haven't authorized any loan for anyone. There was another pause. Too long to be reassuring. That's odd, he said, his tone careful now. The signature we have on file doesn't seem fully consistent with your driver's license. It might be a clerical error, but I wanted to confirm before it's processed. My throat tightened. Can you send me a copy of that application? Of course, he said. I'll forward it to your email. It should arrive within the next few minutes. I thanked him, ended the call, and stood there staring at the floor. My reflection shimmered faintly in the steel of the refrigerator. Hair still wet, collar half buttoned, the look of someone holding herself together out of sheer force of will. My email chimed. I walked over, opened my laptop on the kitchen counter, and clicked the attachment. The PDF opened to a clean, sterile form. Loan amount $12,500. Applicant Lydia Whitmore, co-signer. Claire Whitmore. My eyes stopped on the signature line. My name written in careful loops. The slant was right. The spacing was close, but it wasn't mine. I zoomed in. The C was too rounded. The tail of the E curved in a way I never wrote it. Someone had practiced. I didn't move for a long moment. Then I closed the laptop softly and just stood there. By the time I drove to work, my pulse had settled into something mechanical. I walked into the office, set my purse on the desk, smiled at the receptionist, answered 2 routine emails. When Mark from accounting passed by, he grinned. "Coffee later, maybe?" I said, forcing a smile. I sat through a client call, nodded in all the right places. Even laughed once when someone made a joke about year-end bonuses. But inside, everything had gone quiet, like the air before a storm. When the meeting ended, I slipped my phone out, scrolled through my inbox again. The email from the bank sat there, proof glowing on the screen. I wanted to forward it to my mother right then, to type something sharp like, "Did you know about this?" But I didn't. I just kept staring at the words until my vision blurred. At noon, I stepped outside for air. The sky was white, heavy with snow. I walked around the block, gloveless, the wind burning my fingers. I dialed Mom's number but stopped before the first ring. What was I going to say? Ask if she knew. Of course she did. Lydia never acted alone. Back inside, my assistant handed me a folder. "You okay?" "Claire," she asked. "You look kind of pale." "Just tired," I said. "Didn't sleep well." The rest of the day passed like a blur. At 5:30, I shut down my computer and sat there in the fading office light, staring at my reflection in the dark window. Betrayal doesn't always come with yelling. Sometimes it's a quiet signature on a piece of paper that you were never meant to see. I packed my bag and left. At home, I opened my email archives and searched Whitmore. Refinance. Dozens of messages came up. Mortgage statements, payment receipts, old notices. One from March 2021 caught my eye. Subject line, refinancing notice. Attached was a scanned document from the same bank this time, with both our names. I remembered asking Mom about it when it first arrived. She'd waved it off over the phone. "Oh, that's just some paperwork your father's handling. You don't need to worry, honey. It's grown-up stuff, grown-up stuff." I scrolled to the bottom of the email. The digital signature was mine again. Only it wasn't. I sat back in the chair. My apartment was silent except for the dull hum of the heater. The realization came slow, like cold spreading through water. I had become their safety net, their insurance policy, their permission slip to make bad decisions. All those years of helping had turned into a trap. I closed my eyes and saw Lydia's face the way she used to smile when she wanted something. That soft, breathy laugh she used to get away with everything. I could almost hear Mom's voice, calm and rehearsed. "She's just under pressure, Claire. She'll grow out of it." She never did. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my phone again. I called Michael back, left a voicemail thanking him for alerting me, asking him to freeze any applications with my name. My voice didn't shake, but my heart did. I needed to do something, anything, to feel in control. I went to the closet, pulled out my old black suitcase, wiped the dust from the handle. The sound of the zipper opening echoed through the room. I folded 2 changes of clothes, my laptop, and the worn leather folder where I kept every financial document I'd ever printed. The drive from Denver to St. Louis would take 12 hours if the roads were clear. I checked the weather. Snowstorm expected by midnight. I didn't care. I texted my manager family emergency, taking a few days. He replied with a thumbs up. Before I left, I stood in the doorway staring back at the apartment. It looked the same as it had every morning for years, orderly, comfortable, untouched, but for the first time it didn't feel safe. I locked the door behind me, suitcase rolling softly across the carpeted hallway, and whispered to myself. They turned me into their guarantee. Let's see how they do without it. As I drove east through the darkening sky, the snow started to fall thick and slow. The road shimmered ahead like a blank page. I didn't know what I'd find when I reached St. Louis only that I needed to look them in the eye and hear the truth from their own mouths. And if they couldn't give it to me, I'd find it myself. Snow covered the highway like a white sheet, the world narrowing into two endless lanes, stretching toward Missouri. The wipers scraped rhythmically across the windshield, pushing away the flakes that kept falling faster than I could see. The radio played Silent Night, the kind of version with a children's choir that used to make Mom cry every Christmas Eve. The sound made my stomach tighten. I turned the volume down but didn't turn it off. Some part of me needed the noise to fill the silence. The drive from Denver to St. Louis took 12 hours if you didn't stop too often. And I didn't. Gas station coffee. One granola bar, half a tank, refill, outside Kansas City. I barely spoke except once when I called Emily. She answered on the second ring voice, warm, familiar. Claire. You sound like hell. I've been driving all night. What happened? I told her everything. The bank call, the forged signature, the sudden trip. She didn't interrupt until I finished. Then she sighed. If they pushed you out of Christmas, they'll push you out of everything else, too. But maybe that's not a loss. Maybe it's a chance. I kept my eyes on the road. I'm not trying to get revenge, Em. I just want to know why. Why me? Her voice softened. Because you made it easy. That's what happens to steady people. Everyone builds their lives on your back until you start asking questions. A snowplow passed in the opposite direction, its orange lights blinking through the storm. I tightened my grip on the wheel. I'm not sure what I'll do when I get there. Then don't plan it, she said. Just see what's real. The call ended, and the car was quiet again. I drove through the rest of Missouri in silence, the world reduced to white and gray, and the hum of tires against slush. By the time I pulled into my parents' neighborhood, the sky had gone a deep violet. The houses looked smaller than I remembered, their holiday lights blinking weakly under the snow. The Whitmore house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac wreath, on the door garland draped unevenly across the porch rail. The paint on the siding was peeling in long strips, but the porch light still worked. Bright, too bright, like it was trying to prove something. I parked by the curb, cut the engine, and sat for a moment. My breath fogged the glass. It felt strange sitting there outside my own childhood home like a stranger. When I finally walked up the steps and knocked, I heard movement inside. The door opened a crack, then wider. Mom stood there in a red sweater, her lipstick slightly smudged, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Claire. You didn't tell us you were coming. I figured I'd surprise you. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside. Of course. Come in, honey. It's freezing out there. The warmth inside hit me immediately. Heat cinnamon, the faint scent of pine. The living room was decorated the same way it had been since we were kids. Mismatched ornaments, too many lights, a fake tree that leaned slightly to one side. Lydia sat cross-legged on the floor, wrapping a box in silver paper. She didn't look up right away. When she finally did, her smile was thin. Hey. Dad was in his recliner, the TV on mute, watching some rerun of a game show. He looked older, smaller somehow. Didn't expect you, kiddo, he said, shifting uncomfortably. Yeah, I figured. Mom clapped her hands once too brightly. Well, since you're here, I'll make some tea. She moved toward the kitchen before anyone could say more. I stood there, coat still on, taking in the house that had once felt like a refuge. Every corner seemed staged too clean, too arranged. I caught a glimpse of the old family photo still hanging above the fireplace. Us four, smiling in the backyard. The frame was cracked on one side. Lydia went back to her wrapping scissors, scraping against the paper. You drove all the way from Denver, yeah. She shrugged. That's a long drive. It was silence stretched between us, long and taut. When Mom returned with the tea tray, she set it down carefully on the table. So she said, How's work? Still with the bank. Yeah, I said. Still there. She nodded quickly, like she wanted to fill the air. That's good. You always were so driven. You know your sister's been working on her business again. Interior design mostly. Some freelance work. Lydia's eyes flicked up sharp for just a second. I don't need you to narrate my life, Mom. Mom's smile tightened. I was just telling her you've been keeping busy. I took a sip of tea. It was lukewarm. Sounds like you've both been productive. Dad cleared his throat. Weather held up. Okay on the drive. Mostly. Another silence. When dinner came, it was like watching a play. We'd all rehearsed too many times. Mom passed the potatoes. Lydia picked at her food. Dad chewed slowly, eyes on his plate. So, Mom said, Finally, does Denver have snow yet? Yeah, I said. Cold as here. Maybe colder. I set my fork down. Feels a lot like this house. Mom's smile faltered. You always had a dramatic streak. I didn't answer. After dinner, I helped clear the table. The kitchen was too quiet except for the sound of plates clinking in the sink. Mom dried her hands on a towel, her movements stiff. You didn't have to come all this way, Claire. It's late. I needed to. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway where Lydia's shadow moved past the light. For what I met her gaze. To see things clearly. She didn't reply. Just turned back to the sink. Later, in my old bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed. The wallpaper still had faint outlines where my high school posters used to hang. My suitcase leaned against the dresser untouched. The house creaked in the cold, same as it always had. Through the thin walls, I heard their voices. Lydia's first, sharp, anxious. She knows Mom. I can feel it. Then Mom lower, urgent. Keep your voice down. If she finds out, everything falls apart. I froze. The words came like a chill running down my spine. I sat there staring into the dark, every sound in the house magnified. The tick of the clock, the hum of the furnace, the whisper of voices beyond the wall. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be searched for. It slips under the door while you're pretending to sleep. I lay back, staring at the ceiling. The taste of lukewarm tea still in my mouth, and listened until their voices faded into silence. The morning light crept through the thin curtains, cold and silvers. I woke earlier than anyone else, the kind of restless dawn where sleep had given up pretending. The house was quiet, except for the slow hum of the heater and the faint creak of wood settling in the cold. I moved through the hallway, the floorboards remembering exactly where to groan beneath my feet. In the kitchen, I brewed a pot of coffee. Dad's old brand, the one that smelled burnt no matter how carefully you made it. The smell pulled me backward through time. For a second, I could almost see him sitting at the table, reading the newspaper glasses sliding down his nose, nodding along to the morning radio. But that version of him felt like a stranger now. I poured a cup black no sugar and made my way to his room. The door was half open. His room had barely changed since I was a teenager. The same worn recliner by the window, the same framed picture of our family at the lake, the same faint scent of medicine and mint cream. His slippers were still tucked neatly under the bed. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. Then I set the coffee on the nightstand and began tidying. The shelves by his recliner were cluttered with old magazines, half-empty pill bottles, and folded receipts. As I started stacking the books, something caught my eye. It was a hardback copy of The Old Man and the Sea. The spine was creased, the cover faded. Dad had loved Hemingway. Said the story reminded him of fighting battles no one could see. When I picked it up, it felt heavier than it should have been. The cover was slightly warped, like something had been tucked inside too long. I opened it carefully. An envelope slid out first, yellowed at the edges, my name written across the front in Dad's shaky handwriting. Claire. Underneath it, taped to the inside cover, was a small USB drive. For a moment, I just stared at both the coffee cooling beside me. Then I sat down on the edge of his bed and unfolded the note inside the envelope. Claire, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't keep the secret anymore. I should have told you sooner. Find a lawyer named Nina Graves in Denver. She'll know what to do. Protect yourself, honey. Dad. My heart dropped to somewhere low and deep, where words couldn't reach. I found my laptop in my bag, plugged in the USB drive, and waited. A folder popped up labeled Documents. My cursor hovered over it. Fingers trembling slightly before I clicked. In one were dozens of files, statements, scanned forms, emails. I opened one marked Refinancing Whitmore Home, 2021. It was an email chain between Dad and a financial consultant. I read it once, then again, as if maybe the meaning would change. Attached are the refinance documents. Per Eleanor's request, the co-signer has been added. Signature by Claire. Below that, another reply. Eleanor insisted this was urgent. Lydia needed the funds immediately. The final message was short, written late at night. Richard, please sign where indicated. Your daughter doesn't need to be bothered with this. My breath caught. My hand hovered over the trackpad. They'd used my name again. My credit. My trust. I scrolled further down the thread and saw Dad's brief reply. 2 sentences, both hesitant. I don't feel right about this. Claire should know. And then a single response from Mom. She doesn't need to. She'd only make it harder. The silence that followed inside me was deafening. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling fan above me, its blades unmoving. I could almost hear Dad's voice from years ago when I was 18 and terrified about leaving for college. He'd hugged me tight on the porch and said, "Family is the safest place you'll ever have, kiddo, no matter what happens out there." Now those words echoed like a cruel joke. I don't know how long I sat there before I noticed Lydia's footsteps in the hallway. Her reflection appeared in the mirror beside the bookshelf. Hair, perfect makeup already done, as if she had a performance to attend. "Morning," she said, voice too casual. I closed the laptop slowly. "Morning." Her eyes darted to the coffee cup, then to the bed, then to me. "What are you doing in Dad's room?" "Just cleaning up a bit," I said. "It's a mess in here." She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You always did like cleaning up other people's messes." There was something in her tone, half sneer, half defense, that made my stomach turn. "I found a book," I said evenly. She raised an eyebrow. "A book?" "Yeah, The Old Man and the Sea. Remember how Dad used to read it out loud when we were kids?" Her lips curled. "Sure. He liked depressing stories." I held her gaze. He also liked honesty. Her smile faltered for a second, then returned sharper. "Well, maybe he finally realized honesty doesn't pay the bills." She turned to leave, and I said quietly, "Lydia." She stopped. "I'm not here to fight," I said. "I just want the truth." She looked back at me, eyes narrowing. Truth is overrated. Then she walked away, heels clicking down the hall. I sat there, hands cold around the coffee cup, watching the doorway she'd just disappeared through. Pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sits quietly like the air after an explosion. Heavy, invisible, impossible to breathe. I picked up the book again, running my thumb over the worn spine. Inside it still smelled faintly of Dad's cologne, a mix of cedar and aftershave. For a moment I wanted to believe he'd meant to protect me, that this note was his way of trying. But part of me knew. It wasn't protection anymore. It was confession. I stood, slid the USB into my pocket, and headed toward the door. As I stepped into the hallway, Lydia was standing there pretending to look through the mail on the table. She didn't move when I passed. Her eyes met mine for just a second, calm and calculating. "What were you looking for?" she asked. "The truth," I said. I walked past her through the front door and into the cold morning air. The wind cut sharp across my face, but for the first time since I arrived, I felt awake. The city looked different when I got back. Denver in January was always gray, but this time, the cold felt sharper, more deliberate. The snow on the sidewalks had frozen into thin sheets of ice that cracked under my boots as I crossed toward the tall white building downtown, the one with the brass plaque that read, "Nina Graves, Attorney at Law." Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper. Everything was orderly white walls, clean lines, no clutter. The receptionist led me down a short hallway to Nina's office. She stood when I entered, a woman in her early 50s, short hair streaked with silver glasses hanging from a thin chain. Her size didn't match the weight she carried, the kind of quiet authority that filled a room without raising its voice. "Claire," she said, offering a small, firm handshake. "You brought the documents." I nodded, pulling the USB drive from my coat pocket and placing it on her desk. "There's more on here than I know what to do with." She gestured for me to sit. "Let's start with what you do know." I told her everything. How the bank had called the fake signature the refinance email, the note hidden in my father's book. I talked for nearly 20 minutes without stopping, my words spilling faster, as if saying them out loud might make them less real. Nina listened without interrupting her pen hovering over a legal pad but barely writing. When I finally ran out of air, she leaned back and exhaled through her nose. "What you're describing isn't a mistake," she said quietly. "It's identity fraud. And it's been happening for years." The words landed heavy, even though I already knew. I straightened in the chair, my palms flat against my knees. "If I report this, it'll destroy them. My parents, my sister, everyone." Nina studied me for a moment. "Families aren't destroyed by truth, Claire. They're destroyed by lies that go on too long." I looked away, my throat tight. The framed certificates on her wall seemed to blur. "They'll never forgive me. Then they'll never have to." She said simply. "Forgiveness isn't the same as accountability." She turned the USB in her fingers, then slid it into her computer. The faint hum of the fan filled the room. You said your sister's name is Lydia, yes. She's the one who forged your signature. I nodded once. I'm sure of it. Nina's tone didn't change. And your mother? She knew, I said. She always knows. She makes the choices sound noble. It's for the family, she says. Every decision wrapped in guilt like a gift I didn't ask for. Nina typed something, eyes moving quickly over the screen. I've seen this pattern before. One responsible sibling becomes the anchor. Everyone else learns to drift. Her matter-of-fact tone should have hurt, but instead it steadied me. What can I do, I asked. We protect you, she said. First, we create a personal trust. Your assets go there untouchable by anyone else. Second, we freeze your credit with all 3 bureaus. No new loans, no refinancing, no fake co-signing. Third, we contact your bank and request a fraud review. And the house I asked, my parents' place. Nina looked up. It's technically in your name, right? They refinanced it under mine, I said, without permission. Then we make it official, she said. Transfer the title to your trust. They'll retain residency rights, but they won't be able to borrow against it again. I stared at her, the weight of the idea settling in. That sounds final. Her gaze softened. You've spent your life protecting them from the consequences of their choices. Now you're protecting yourself from the consequences of their habits. I felt something tighten in my chest. Fear, maybe, or grief wearing a new face. If I do this, there's no going back. Nina folded her hands, her voice low. Are you ready to lose them? I thought about the kitchen back home, the silence at dinner, the whisper behind the door. If she finds out everything falls apart, maybe they were right. Maybe this was the falling apart. I already lost them, I said quietly. This just makes it official. Nina nodded once as if that was the answer she expected. Then we start today. She pulled a folder from her drawer, flipped it open, and slid a stack of papers toward me. These are the authorizations. I'll file everything by morning. Once your credit freeze is active, no one, family included, can open or modify any accounts in your name. Ever. I looked down at the pages. My name appeared again and again across the lines, but this time, it was mine. No one else's handwriting, no one else's control. Nina handed me a pen. Sign here. I hesitated for just a second, not because I doubted her, but because signing anything now felt different. Every pen stroke carried history. As the tip touched paper, sunlight caught the glass of the office window and flashed across the page. I signed once, twice again, each motion a quiet reclamation. When I finished, Nina gathered the pages neatly. You did the right thing, she said. This isn't vengeance. It's a boundary. I met her eyes. I'm not trying to punish them. I know, she said, but you are teaching them that the person they've been using finally learned to close the door. I let out a long breath, leaning back in the chair. The sound of the pen clicking shut felt final in a way words couldn't describe. Outside, the sky had turned a dull silver, the kind that promised more snow. I watched it through the window, the faint reflection of my own face staring back. I'd spent my whole life saving them from the world. It had never occurred to me that someday I'd need to save myself from them. When I stood to leave, Nina walked me to the door. You'll hear from me in a few days, she said. If anything changes, I'll call. Thank you, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. As I stepped into the hallway, the echo of my heels on the tile sounded strange. Too loud, too certain. I realized it was the sound of something I hadn't heard in years, my own footsteps leading somewhere I chose. This wasn't revenge. This was the first time I had chosen me. The call came just after 10 on a Thursday morning when the office was too quiet and the coffee had already gone cold. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Missouri area code. I almost ignored it, but something about it made me pick up. Ms. Whitmore. The voice was male, middle-aged, polite in the way people are when they're not sure if they're bothering you. This is Tom Becker from Fairview Storage over in St. Louis. We're clearing out a few old rental units and there's one here under your family's name. I believe there's a box labeled for you. Thought you might want to check before we discard anything. I frowned, turning away from my computer. I've never rented a storage unit there. I figured, he said. The paperwork lists a Mr. Richard Whitmore as the account holder. Looks like it hasn't been touched in years, but the inventory log has a note. Box for Claire W. That ring any bells? My mouth went dry. Not really. I said slowly, "Can you tell me what's in it?" He hesitated. I didn't open it, but it's the only item left in that space. Your parents cleared the rest a few months ago, according to the file. Something inside me tightened. "I'll come get it." "You don't have to rush," Tom said kindly. "We're not tossing it today." "No," I said. "I'll be there tomorrow." By the time I hung up, I was already booking the flight. That night, I packed light, a carry-on my laptop, and a folder with copies of every document Nina had filed. The next morning before dawn, I was on a plane heading east. Through the window, the clouds looked like blank pages waiting for me to write something I didn't want to read. When the plane landed in St. Louis, the air hit like a slap, wet, cold, heavy with winter. The sky was colorless. I rented a small gray sedan, programmed Fairview storage into the GPS, and drove in silence. When people hide too much for too long, the truth tends to end up where they forgot to erase it. Fairview storage sat on the edge of town, rows of metal doors stretching into the distance, the kind of place where forgotten things wait to be discovered. Tom met me at the front office. He was in his late 50s, wearing a denim jacket and a baseball cap with a faded logo. His eyes were kind but cautious. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, shaking my hand. "Glad you came. It's a mess out there, but I think I found what you're looking for." He led me through the narrow aisles between storage units, our footsteps echoing on the concrete. The air smelled of dust and cold metal. Overhead, a fluorescent light flickered like it couldn't decide whether to stay alive. We stopped in front of a small unit near the end of the row. The metal door was half open, a padlock hanging loose on the latch. Tom pulled the door up the rest of the way, and the sound echoed down the hall. Inside, the space was nearly empty except for a folding table in the center and a single cardboard box sitting on top. The box was sealed, but worn, the corners soft with age. On one side, written in thick black marker, were the words, "Claire W." My heart pounded once heavy and loud. Tom cleared his throat. "Didn't seem like junk to me, so I didn't toss it. Figured you'd want to decide yourself." "Thank you," I said quietly. He stepped back, giving me space. I approached the table and peeled the tape back. The cardboard groaned softly as it opened. Inside were stacks of papers, receipts, invoices, printouts, old notebooks. The smell of dust hit me hard like opening a tomb. The first thing I pulled out was a bundle of folded papers bound by a rubber band. I unwrapped it and froze. Photocopies of my driver's license, my old address, my signature. Underneath, several loan forms from different banks, applications I had never seen. Each one had my name typed neatly at the top, paired with another name below it. Lydia Whitmore. The edges of the pages blurred. I blinked hard, but it didn't help. My hands felt cold, like I was holding someone else's life. Beneath the stack was a small blue notebook. I recognized Lydia's handwriting immediately, the looping letters, the way she dotted her I's with tiny circles. I opened to the first page. First Capital Credit Union. Use Claire's name. Mom says it'll be fine. The room tilted slightly. Page after page, the notes continued. Lists of bills, bank names, rough calculations. In one corner, scribbled in pencil. "She never checks anyway." I sank onto the folding chair beside the table, the paper trembling between my fingers. "Everything all right, Ms. Whitmore?" Tom asked softly from the doorway. I looked up at him, my voice barely above a whisper. Who had access to this unit? He rubbed the back of his neck. Just the account holder. Richard Whitmore and anyone he authorized, but he hesitated, glancing toward the door. "A man came by last week asking about it, said he was family. I told him we couldn't release anything without ID. He didn't leave a name, just looked nervous, and left in a hurry." My stomach dropped. "Did he say what he wanted?" "No," Tom said. "But he asked if there was a box with your name on it." I stared at the box again. The black marker letters staring back at me like an accusation. "Thank you for not giving it to him," I said quietly. "Didn't feel right," he replied. "Figured this kind of thing should go to the person it's meant for." I nodded. "You figured right?" He tipped his hat respectful and stepped out of the unit. "Take your time. I'll lock up when you're done." When he was gone, I pulled out my phone and began taking photos. Every document, every page, every name. The flash from the camera cut through the cold air like static. I took picture after picture until my hands stopped shaking. When I was done, I packed everything back into the box, taped it shut again, and wrote across the top in fresh ink, "Keep." I carried it to the car, the weight of it heavier than it looked. The sky above was still gray, the kind of color that could crush you if you stared too long. As I set the box on the passenger seat, I caught my reflection in the window. Pale, tired eyes, hollow, but awake. I'd thought I'd already uncovered the whole truth, that the betrayal was limited to one forged signature, one loan, one desperate choice. But sitting there, the car engine rumbling softly beneath me, I realized how wrong I was. This wasn't the whole story. It was only the part they hadn't managed to bury. Sunday morning in St. Louis began the same way it always did for my mother, with routine and performance. The bells at St. Luke's rang at 9 sharp, echoing through the frozen streets. Inside, the church glowed with soft light reflecting off gold ornaments and pine garlands. Eleanor and Lydia sat in their usual pew, dressed in red, smiling with the kind of grace that only works when everyone's watching. Reverend Simmons stood at the pulpit, his voice deep and smooth. And today we give special thanks to the Whitmore family for their continued generosity. Their faith and service are an example to us all. Applause rose from the congregation. Lydia's hand tightened around my mother's. The corners of her smile trembled. In the row behind them, Nancy Fowler, our old neighbor who never missed a piece of gossip, leaned toward her friend and whispered, "I heard the bank's been looking into them. Some kind of paperwork issue." The whisper spread faster than the hymn could rise. People shifted in their seats, pretending not to listen. Reverend Simmons continued unaware, or pretending to be. The applause faded. Lydia's nails dug into my mother's palm. Eleanor's smile froze her jaw stiff beneath the powdered blush. In Denver, I was watching the service from my couch. The live stream played on my phone. Someone in town must have uploaded it to the church's Facebook page. The camera panned over the congregation, stopping briefly on my family. There they were, radiant in red, framed by stained glass and hypocrisy. I turned the volume down and watched in silence. The image flickered slightly the way old film does when it's close to burning. My phone buzzed beside me. Emily's name flashed on the screen. "You watching this?" she asked when I picked up. "I am. You okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Sometimes justice doesn't need to be loud. It just needs an audience." There was a pause on the line. "You sound calm." "I am calm," I said, though my fingers were clenched tight around the phone. For the first time in a long time, I don't have to defend myself. When the call ended, I set the phone down and looked at the box from Fairview sitting by the door. I'd brought it with me straight from the airport to Nina's office that morning. Her building looked the same, quiet, sterile, efficient. Inside, she was already waiting. "Morning," she said, standing as I entered. "You look like you haven't slept." "I didn't," I admitted. I placed the box on her desk. This was in a storage unit my dad rented. It has everything: applications, IDs, even my sister's notes. Nina pulled her glasses on and flipped open the lid. The papers rustled like dry leaves. She read quickly, scanning each page, her eyes narrowing. "This is the key," she said after a few minutes. "Mark Daniels can use these to verify the fraud in the timeline. Once the banks see this, there's no denying it happened intentionally." I leaned back in the chair. The hum of the ceiling vent filled the room. "So this ends it." "It begins the end," she corrected. "But yes, they won't be able to touch your name again." I nodded, watching as she organized the documents into neat piles. Financial, legal, handwritten. Everything my family had built on lies, reduced to paper and ink. For years I had believed that truth had to come with confrontation, that to expose something meant you had to scream it into the light. But sitting there watching Nina handle the evidence with quiet precision, I realized something else. The truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just waits patient and still until someone is brave enough to pick it up. When I left her office, the winter sun was barely visible through the gray sky. I stopped at a small cafe across the street, ordered coffee I barely tasted, and scrolled through the comments under the livestream post. Most were predictable. "Beautiful service. The Whitmores always give so much to this community." But buried among them, one comment caught my eye. Funny, it read, "Some folks preach generosity while borrowing money they don't plan to repay." No name attached, just a comment already getting likes. I set the phone face down on the table and wrapped both hands around the warm cup. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. But pity is a form of attachment, and I was done being attached to their chaos. That night after the service, I heard from Nina again. Mark's already reviewing the files, she said. He'll send official inquiries to the banks by tomorrow. You won't have to say a word. Good, I said quietly. You don't have to watch them fall apart, Claire, she added. You've done enough. I looked out the window at the snow melting into black puddles on the street. I don't need to watch, I said. I just need to know the curtain finally came down. Somewhere in St. Louis, the stained glass light at St. Luke's faded into evening. Reverend Simmons lingered by the door after service, shaking hands with parishioners as they left. When the crowd thinned, he turned toward the courtyard. Across the street, under a flickering street lamp, he saw Eleanor standing beside her daughter. Lydia's face was streaked with mascara, her shoulders trembling. Eleanor held her close, but didn't look at her. The two of them stood in silence, the performance finally over. From the church steps, Reverend Simmons whispered to himself, "No one stays innocent forever." In Denver, I turned off my phone, the screen going black. The reflection staring back at me was calm, steady, unflinching. For the first time, I felt no need to justify what they'd done or who they'd become. The world would do that for me. I didn't need to be there when the walls cracked. I only needed to know they finally had. The drive back to St. Louis was silent. Snow drifted across the interstate in slow, deliberate spirals, the kind that make you feel like time itself has paused. Nina sat in the passenger seat scanning her notes while Mark Daniels, a tall, calm man from the Financial Crimes Division, rode quietly in the back. None of us spoke much. There was nothing left to debate. By the time we turned onto my parents' street, the light had thinned to gray. The Whitmore house looked smaller than I remembered, its paint chipping under the frost, a wreath still hanging proudly on the door, as if the season hadn't already ended. Dad opened the door before we even knocked. His face looked older, the lines deeper, his shoulders slumped. "Claire," he said softly, almost like he was relieved and terrified all at once. "Dad," I said, my voice steady. He looked past me to Nina and Mark. "Lawyers now, is that really necessary?" I didn't answer. I just stepped inside. The living room was too warm, the air thick with the smell of candles and denial. Mom sat on the couch back straight, dressed as if she'd known this was coming, but still hoped to perform her way through it. Lydia sat beside her, arms crossed, chin high, eyes flashing with the defiance she always mistook for confidence. Nina placed her briefcase on the coffee table and unclasped it. "Mrs. Whitmore? Miss Whitmore?" she said, her tone polite, but unyielding. "I'm here on behalf of my client to review documentation concerning the fraudulent refinancing and unauthorized use of identity associated with this property." Mom's lips trembled. "Fraudulent." No, that's..." She turned to me, tears already gathering. "Claire, we didn't mean harm. I just wanted to keep the house. You know how much this place means to us." Lydia snapped, "Oh, stop pretending this is about morality." "She's got the money, Mom. She always has. It's selfish not to help when you can." Nina calmly laid out the documents one by one, each page a quiet indictment. "Here are the refinance forms bearing Claire's name and falsified signature. Here's the loan application under Lydia's identity, but with Claire's personal information attached. Here are the withdrawals traced to your joint account." Mom's face went pale, her hand flying to her chest. Lydia's jaw clenched. I looked at them both. "You didn't just borrow money. You borrowed my life." Lydia's eyes narrowed. "Oh, please, you make it sound like we stole something. You've always had everything. The degree, the career, the fancy apartment. This was the least you could do for us." "You mean for you," I said, her cheeks flushed. "You think you're better than us because you work in an office and dress like some Wall Street robot? You've never understood family." "Family doesn't mean unconditional access," I said quietly. She stood, hands slamming against the table. "If you go through with this, we lose everything." Dad spoke for the first time, his voice trembling. "We already lost everything. Lydia. We lost it the day your mother and I decided lying to Claire was easier than telling the truth." The room fell silent. Even Lydia froze. Mom's tears finally spilled over. "I just wanted to keep everyone together," she whispered. Nina started collecting the papers again. Her movements were precise, clinical. "Intent doesn't erase the crime, Mrs. Whitmore. These documents will be reviewed by federal investigators. Mr. Daniels will follow up within the week." Mark stepped forward, his expression neutral, but firm. You'll receive a formal notice soon. I'd suggest cooperating fully. It will make a difference. Lydia folded her arms tighter. You're not really going to report this, are you? She said to me, her voice small but still sharp. You wouldn't do that to your own family. I met her eyes. You did it first. Mom sobbed louder, shaking her head. Please, Claire, don't ruin us like this. I'm not ruining you, I said. You did that when you decided I was useful instead of loved. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of the radiator and the wind rattling the window pane. Nina closed her briefcase with a soft click. I'll be in touch, she said, then glancing at Mark. Let's go. I stood, my hands steady for the first time since I arrived. I looked at my father. His eyes met mine, filled with something between shame and gratitude. He nodded once, barely but enough. I turned toward my mother. You always said I was strong, I said quietly. You were right. Just not in the way you meant. She broke down completely, covering her face with her hands. Lydia looked away, jaw set, refusing to cry. I walked to the door. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me like clarity. Snow was beginning to fall again, soft flakes catching in my hair and melting against my skin. Behind me, I heard Nina's voice, calm and final, telling Mark she'd send the files by morning. The air was still, the street empty, except for the faint glow of the streetlights on the snow. When you stop chasing approval, you finally find strength. I took a deep breath, feeling it settle in my chest. The house behind me stayed dark. The storm, for once, was only theirs to weather. A week later, the silence was louder than any argument could have been. In St. Louis, word spread fast. Faster than snow melts, faster than truth, travels faster than I ever expected. The Whitmores, once praised for their generosity and poise, had fallen from grace without a single word from me. On Sunday, the church bulletin at St. Luke's no longer listed the Whitmore family among the patrons. Their name had been quietly replaced by another family's no announcement, no acknowledgement. The space where their donation usually appeared was empty, like a line of scripture torn from the page. Reverend Simmons sent me a letter 3 days later, written in careful cursive, on thick cream stationery. Dear Ms. Whitmore, thank you for reminding us of what integrity truly means. May peace come from truth, even when it hurts. Reverend Charles Simmons. I held the letter for a long time before folding it neatly and tucking it into my drawer. Karma doesn't come with thunder or fire. It arrives quietly, wearing the face of consequence. From what I heard, Mom stopped leaving the house. The blinds stayed drawn. The mailbox filled with uncollected envelopes. Lydia's friends stopped returning her calls, and the small interior design clients she'd courted online backed out of their contracts. One of them posted a comment on her business page. If she lies to family, what would she do to clients? Lydia deleted her account 2 days later. People like to think karma is a storm, but sometimes it's a slow winter, cold, quiet, and impossible to escape. At Nina's office, the light looked softer than usual that afternoon, filtered through the half-closed blinds. Papers were stacked neatly on her desk, her pen poised like a verdict waiting to be written. This is the final step, she said. Sliding the folder toward me. The trust is now active. The house belongs to you. Your father has lifetime residency rights. They can't borrow refinance or alter ownership without your written consent. I nodded, scanning the words I barely had energy to absorb. So that's it. That's it, she said. You've closed every door they used to reach you. The pen felt heavy in my hand, not from guilt, but from the weight of ending something that had defined me for years. I signed the first page, then the second. Each signature a quiet undoing of the person I used to be. The daughter who paid, the sister who fixed the woman who never said no. Sunlight caught the polished wood of the desk, reflecting in gold streaks across the paper. Nina smiled faintly. You did what most people can't, she said. You stopped a cycle. I didn't answer. Some victories don't need applause. Afterward, I walked outside. The air was cool, the sky pale blue, with thin clouds stretching like silk. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, feeling the stillness of it all. The world hadn't changed. Back in St. Louis, I imagined the living room where I'd grown up. The same beige carpet, the same picture of our family from a decade ago. Dad smiling, Mom proud, Lydia radiant, and me off to the side holding a glass of wine, already half a stranger. Mom was probably sitting there now staring at nothing. The house that used to feel too small, suddenly too large, too quiet. In my mind, I could almost hear her voice. "I did it for us, Claire." But there was no us anymore. Lydia called her that night. I know because Dad told me later, his voice heavy and tired when we spoke. He said she sounded desperate, panicked. "They're all talking about me, Mom," Lydia said, pacing the kitchen. "The church, my friends, everyone. They say I forged things, that I'm a liar." Eleanor didn't look up from the couch. "You need to stop talking. I only did what you told me to," Lydia shouted, her voice cracked somewhere between anger and pleading. But Eleanor didn't respond. She just turned her face toward the darkened window, as if waiting for forgiveness that wouldn't come. Dad said Lydia hung up on her, stormed out, and hasn't been back since. In Denver, I poured myself a glass of wine that night and sat by the window. The city lights blinked against the mountain's reflections shimmering across the glass. It was quiet, but not empty. Justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be seen. And as I looked out at the quiet skyline, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. The part of me that once craved apology, explanation, reconciliation, it had burned away, leaving something steadier in its place. Peace isn't loud. It's the sound of your own life finally belonging only to you. By March, the story had already spread beyond St. Louis. It started as a small segment on the local evening news. An ongoing investigation into identity fraud at a Missouri bank is widening. The footage flashed across the screen, blurred documents, courthouse steps, and a photo of my family pulled from some church newsletter. The anchor's voice was calm, detached, like this was just another story before the weather report. I watched it once, maybe twice. The names weren't spoken aloud, but the image said everything. I muted the TV and sat back on the couch. For the first time, seeing it didn't sting. It just felt like closure, ugly, necessary, real. A week later, the FBI called. Nina's office felt smaller that morning, the blinds half drawn against the pale spring sun. Agent Rebecca Collins introduced herself as she entered. Early 40s, short hair, eyes that had seen too many confessions. Her badge gleamed when she flipped it open. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, shaking my hand. "I'm here to confirm the materials you submitted. The documentation your attorney provided was substantial. We've verified the bank's cooperation." Nina gestured for us both to sit. "Agent Collins is here to discuss whether you'd like to press criminal charges," she explained. Rebecca's tone softened. "You're within your rights to file. The evidence is clear. Multiple forged signatures, fraudulent refinancing, and misuse of personal identification. You'd have a strong case." I folded my hands in my lap, staring at the edge of Nina's desk. "If I press charges, what happens to them? They'll face federal investigation," Rebecca said. "Possibly prosecution, financial penalties, maybe even jail time, depending on who authorized what." The words hung in the air like a slow exhale. Nina turned to me. "It's your choice, Claire. This is where your power lies." I thought of my mother's shaking hands, Lydia's defiant face, my father's tired eyes. The day he told me, we already lost everything. For so long, I'd believed justice had to look like punishment. But sitting there under the sterile light of that office, I realized something had shifted. "I don't want to ruin what's left," I said quietly. "I just want the truth to stand on its own." Rebecca studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Understood. We'll keep your statement on record. If new evidence arises, we'll contact you. But you're right. The truth can stand alone." When she left, the room fell into a gentle silence. Nina leaned back in her chair. "You're stronger than you think," she said. "I'm just tired," I replied. She smiled slightly. "That's usually what strength looks like when it's real." Later that evening, I drove downtown to a small apartment complex near Capitol Hill. My father had moved in 2 weeks earlier. The apartment was modest. A single bedroom, old furniture, the smell of tomato soup simmering in the kitchen. He looked up as I walked in, a little startled, then smiled. "You made it." I hung my coat by the door. "You're cooking." He chuckled softly. "Trying to. Don't expect miracles." The soup was simple. Broth noodles, a little parsley, but it was the first meal we'd shared in years that didn't feel like a performance. We ate quietly, the hum of the refrigerator filling the gaps. After a while, Dad set his spoon down. "I should have said something, Claire. I saw what your mother and sister were doing, and I kept quiet because it felt easier. I thought protecting them meant keeping peace. I looked at him. Really looked, and saw how age had crept into his face. You don't need to explain, Dad. Silence is its own kind of burden. You carried it long enough. He nodded slowly. I lost your mother before I ever realized it. Lydia, too. I don't blame you for walking away. I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. You don't have to lose me, I said. You just have to live honestly now. He smiled, tired but genuine. That I can do. Forgiveness isn't letting people back in. It's deciding the past doesn't get to define you anymore. As spring crept closer, everything began to move quietly into place. Lydia packed up what she could and left St. Louis for Chicago. No forwarding address, no goodbyes. Mom stopped going to church altogether. Reverend Simmons tried to visit once, but she refused to answer the door. Neighbors said the blinds stayed closed even during the day. Sometimes I imagined her sitting in that dim living room, surrounded by silence, still trying to believe the story she'd told herself, that all of this had been out of love. But love without accountability is just control in prettier words. One evening I wrote an email to Emily. The subject line was simple. I'm okay. Hey, it's been a while. I wanted you to know things have settled. The house is safe. Dad's here in Denver, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe again. You once told me peace comes when you stop fighting battles that were never yours. I think I finally understand that now. Claire. When I hit send, I felt something lift, a quiet, steady exhale. I didn't realize I'd been holding. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the early evening sky. Somewhere, maybe hundreds of miles away, my mother was facing her own silence. My sister, her own reflection, and me. I was learning to exist without guilt, without performance, without apology. The truth had done its work. I didn't need vengeance. I didn't need validation. All I needed was air, and finally I could breathe it. Christmas Eve came quietly that year. Denver was covered in a soft hush of snow, the kind that makes the city sound gentler than it really is. From my apartment window, I could see the streetlights glowing through the flakes' halos of gold against the dark. The world outside felt distant, peaceful in a way I hadn't known in years. Inside, the air was warm and full of small comforts. The oven hummed softly, carrying the scent of roasted chicken and herbs. On the counter, vegetables caramelized in a pan, beside a bottle of Pinot Noir, breathing slowly in the open air. I wasn't cooking for anyone but myself, and somehow that felt like the truest celebration I could have. When I set the table, I didn't reach for the extra plates the way I used to. Just one. One napkin, one glass, one meal that didn't have to serve as a gesture or an apology. The quiet wrapped around me like a blanket instead of a punishment. A small stack of mail sat on the edge of my table, and at the top was a card from Emily. She'd sent it the week before, but I hadn't opened it yet. I tore the envelope carefully, smiling when I saw the handwriting inside. Freedom begins when you stop apologizing for existing. I laughed under my breath, the sound catching in the stillness. Of course she'd written that. She always had a way of saying the thing I needed to hear, without asking if I was ready to hear it. I set the card beside my wine glass, its edges curling slightly from the heat of the room. After dinner, I walked to my desk and opened my laptop. The familiar folder blinked on the screen. Evidence. Zip. I hadn't touched it in months, but I hadn't deleted it either. Some things you keep not out of spite, but as a reminder of what it cost to find yourself. I clicked it once, watched the progress bar appear, and saved the backup to an encrypted drive. Last year they told me not to come to Christmas because I made someone uncomfortable. This year the truth made them uncomfortable instead. I closed the laptop and turned off the lamp. Only the tree lights remained. A small artificial one I'd bought at a discount store glowing faintly in the corner. It didn't mean much, but it was mine. I poured the last of the wine into my glass and stepped out onto the balcony. The wind was sharp, brushing against my face, pulling loose strands of hair across my cheeks. Snowflakes landed on my coat, melting almost instantly. Below, the city stretched out in quiet motion. Cars sliding carefully along the streets. Strangers hurrying home, laughter faint and distant. I lifted the glass, letting the cold sting my fingertips. I didn't leave my family. I whispered to the night. I just walked away from their version of me. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Somewhere behind me, my phone buzzed. A holiday message from a coworker, a digital wish for peace and light. I didn't open it right away. I stayed there for a long moment, breathing in the clean, frozen air, letting the quiet fill every corner of the space where guilt used to live. Inside, the clock struck 9. The sound was soft, steady grounding. I went back in, set the empty glass on the counter, and turned off the lights. The reflection in the window caught my eye. A woman alone, yes, but unbroken, standing in the life she'd built for herself, piece by piece. Karma isn't punishment. It's the moment you stop hurting. That night, I sat by the window with a blanket around my shoulders and watched the snow fall until it blurred the world into white. I didn't think about the past. I didn't wonder if they were sitting somewhere together, pretending not to remember what they'd done. I didn't wish for reconciliation or revenge. I only felt the weight of silence. Clean, peaceful, finally mine. If you've ever had to draw a line to protect yourself, you know this kind of quiet, it's not empty. It's earned. It's what happens when the noise ends and you realize you survived it. If my story made you think about your own boundaries, your own sense of justice, stay a while. There will always be room here for stories like ours. The ones where survival doesn't look like victory but feels like peace.